Got a nice crowd here tonight. I know we've got, I won't say nicer, but we've got a larger crowd virtually. My name is Wiley Cash. I'm the Executive Director of Literary Arts here at the university. And one of the things that I do every year is I organize the Common Word Community Read. And as you may know, our text for the fall is this book, I Came as a Shadow, the autobiography of Coach John Thompson, who was a longtime coach of Georgetown University. And so we're going to be talking about Georgetown tonight with Dr. Adam Rothman. And I'll tell you a little bit about him in just a moment. But I want to go ahead and spill here in person. So please make sure that you're watching the Common Word website, unca.edu/commonword for that schedule. Incredible beverages. So stay tuned for that as well. I want to, in a moment, welcome Professor Adam Rothman from Georgetown University is here tonight. Georgetown is obviously on our minds this semester with the Common Word. And I'm really excited to say that Georgetown legend, really NBA legend, Eric Sleepy Floyd will join us here in person on Thursday, November 16th. At 7 p.m., I'll be in conversation with him. And if you've read Coach Thompson's book, you know that he praises Sleepy Floyd, and he says that we would be at an away game, and Sleepy would come up and say, "Coach, I'm missing shots. I think something is wrong with these rims." And it wouldn't be facetious. He really meant it. And John Thompson says there probably was something wrong with the rims because he was the best scorer. He said that Eric Floyd was the best scorer he ever coached, and he coached Patrick Ewing, he coached Dikembe Mutombo, and also Allen Iverson. So we'll talk to Eric and hear what it was like to play under John Thompson. Department and Director of Georgetown's Center for the Study of Slavery and Its Legacies. He studies the history of the United States from the Revolution to the Civil War, and the history of slavery and abolition with Elsa Barraza Mendoza. It is a collection of primary sources, essays by scholars, and articles by journalists that document Georgetown's history of slavery and the school's recent efforts to confront that past. He served on Georgetown's Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation in 2015 and 16, and is currently the principal curator of the Georgetown Slavery Archive. He is also the author of Beyond Freedom's Reach, A Kidnapping in the Twilight of Slavery. The book tells the story of 3 children who were taken from New Orleans to Cuba by their owner during the U.S. Civil War and their mother's effort to recover them. His first book was Slave Country, American Expansion and the Origins of the Deep South. And in 2007, he co-authored Major Problems in Atlantic History with his colleague, Allison Gaines. He was a distinguished visiting scholar at the John W. Klug Center at the Library of Congress in 2018, where he created the African American Passages, Black Lives in the 19th Century podcast. He is an OAH Distinguished Lecturer. Adam also made several appearances on Study Hall, an improv comedy show in Philadelphia. And that's what he's going to talk about tonight. Friends, Dr. Adam Rothman.
that generous introduction. I have to say that I don't want you to get the wrong idea about my appearances at that improv comedy show. I was not supposed to be funny. The whole show is based on academics giving very brief lectures about their subjects of expertise, and then a group of actual comedians turning that into something funny with sketch comedy. So all I had to do was give a 5-minute talk about history, and it didn't have to be funny. I tried to be funny, but usually wasn't. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Wally, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Common Word program for inviting me, and particularly for inviting me to talk about Georgetown's history of slavery, which on the face of it might not seem perfectly aligned with the memoir, the autobiography of John Thompson, famous basketball coach. But actually, these things are intimately connected, as Coach Thompson himself recognized and wrote about in a very powerful way in I Came as a Shadow. I want to start with this quotation from the book. Hopefully you all made it through the book to the last chapter, which is about memory and the importance of not forgetting. In that chapter, Thompson writes, "I think not forgetting makes you strong." And of course, not forgetting also makes for a good memoir. Remembered a lot of things. But in that line and in that chapter, he's not really talking about the details of his own life. He's talking about history, the importance of remembering the history of American slavery. His own family lived that history. And Thompson talks about it in a particularly compelling way in that chapter. Before we dive into the specific history, I just want to reflect for a moment on this idea of the importance of learning and knowing our history. Now, why would that be the case? Why is it the case that not forgetting makes you strong? Well, here are a few possibilities. The first, and this comes up in Thompson's memoir, is that not forgetting history can be a source of inspiration. Thompson talks about the enslaved men and women who toiled in the tobacco fields of Maryland, his own ancestors. And he always reminds himself that their sacrifices helped him be in the position that he got to. So understanding, knowing that history, not forgetting that history can be a source of inspiration. Not forgetting can also be a source of wisdom. Everybody has heard the old adage that you don't want to, I always get this, I really always get this wrong, right? You don't, what is it? You don't, who can help me here? You don't want to, if you forget your history, are doomed to repeat it, right? Those who forget their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. The idea here is that history is full of human error and folly. And that if you don't pay attention to that, if you don't know that history, then you're destined to fall into the same traps our ancestors fell into. The only way to escape that, the only way to do the right thing in the present, is to understand people who did the wrong thing in the past. So we have to learn from people's mistakes, and learning from their mistakes can be a source of wisdom in the present. Now, I don't love this way of thinking about history, because it means that history is just full of error, full of mistakes. But it's not just that. It's also full of wisdom. So we can learn from the wise things that people did as well and try to emulate them. So not forgetting can lead us to inspiration, it can lead us to wisdom, And above all, I think it can lead us to a new kind of understanding of the present. How did we get here? How are we in the position that we're in today? Well, it's only an understanding of the history that lets us even contemplate why we are in the position we're in today. So those are some of the reasons why not forgetting makes you strong, and I hope you keep those in mind as we dig into the specific details of Georgetown's history of slavery. In that last chapter, John Thompson lays out the basic history of Georgetown's connections to slavery. The idea that it was founded by slave owners, that enslaved people built the university, labored at the university. The sale of enslaved people helped to finance the university and pull it out of a crushing debt. He lays out that history very briefly, but he knew it. Today I want to give you a bit more detail. But the thing that I really appreciate about Thompson's memoir is that he acknowledges the ways that Georgetown of late has been wrestling with that history, has been facing that history squarely, and trying to use that history to motivate us in the present. So another quotation from the book is that Georgetown is not one of the deniers. We do not deny our history at Georgetown. We examine it, we explore it, we reflect on it, we teach it, and we try to act on its legacies. This has been a big part of my own life for all the time I've been teaching at Georgetown, which is now more than 20 years, but especially since 2015. Now, as you heard from Wiley, I'm a historian. I'm a specialist in the history of American slavery. I've been teaching classes on the history of American slavery since I got to Georgetown in 2000. And I knew something about Georgetown's own history of slavery, but I never made it the central focus of my own teaching until 2015. In 2015, President Jack DeGioia, president of Georgetown University, someone who comes up a lot in John Thompson's memoir, DeGioia launched a working group for slavery, memory, and reconciliation. And he charged that working group with researching Georgetown's historical connections to slavery and making a set of recommendations to the university about how we should acknowledge that history. I was lucky enough to become a member of that working group, and that experience really changed my life. It certainly changed what I teach at Georgetown, and it changed my whole relationship to history, as I hope will become clear. But one thing that I discovered as a member of that working group was that Georgetown's history of slavery was never hidden. It was never a secret. People have been writing about it for 100 years. Jesuits have been writing about it for 100 years. My predecessors at Georgetown had built a curriculum in the American Studies department around it in the 1990s. There were people who knew this history, including President DeGioia. But even though the history was not a secret, it also wasn't widely known. The news that the clergy who founded Georgetown were slave owners, that the university's roots were steeped in slavery, that was a revelation and a shock to most people around the university community. And I felt like that was a failure on the part of my tribe of scholars who knew the history but had not done a good enough job communicating it to our own university community and the public. So one way that my life has changed since 2015 is I've really dedicated myself to telling the story of Georgetown's history to anybody who will listen. So I appreciate you being here today to listen, and also, I think, to engage in the conversation about the meaning of all of this. So what I want to talk about today is, first of all, Georgetown's history of slavery, because it's an intense and complicated history. It's a fascinating history, but it's also a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery. And the whole history of American slavery is a vast topic that can be hard to grab a hold of. So looking at it through an institution like Georgetown can be a way of reducing it to a more human scale, and of understanding what that history really means. So we'll start with the history. And then I want to talk about the other two elements of what the working group did: memory and reconciliation. I want to tell you some of the things that have been going on at Georgetown since 2015 as we wrestle with and reckon with this history. So that's where I'm coming from. Pardon me for a second while I drink of water. Georgetown's history of slavery. We've got to go way back. Georgetown was founded by a group of ex-Jesuit clergy in Maryland in the 1780s. I say ex-Jesuit because at that moment, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, had actually been suppressed by the Pope. But they were still lurking around Maryland. They had found a way to hang on and get a foothold in the new United States. But the Jesuits had been in Maryland since the first ship of English Catholic settlers arrived there in 1634. And in fact, those Jesuits were latecomers as settlers to the Americas. The Jesuits had accompanied Spanish and Portuguese settlers to the Americas from the middle of the 1500s. They had a foothold in the Americas, and not only did they have a foothold in the Americas, but wherever they went across the Americas, the Jesuits had become slave owners. They had to fund their own operations, their churches and schools and missions. And the easiest way to do that across the Americas in the early modern period was to become landlords and slaveholders. So by the time the Jesuits arrived in Maryland in 1634, there's already a vast Jesuit slaveholding complex across the Americas. And the Jesuits had already come to very sophisticated theological justifications for their slaveholding, which boiled down to the idea that slavery was a Christianizing institution, a way of bringing non-Christian people into the world of Christianity. So more on that in a bit. The Jesuits did not immediately become slave owners in Maryland. It took a while. But they became big landowners across Maryland, and by the early 1700s, they had made a transition in their labor force from white indentured and tenant farmers to African chattel enslaved people. And they did so at the very time that other landlords in the Chesapeake were making the same transition from indentured servitude to slavery. This is one of the ways where Georgetown's history and the history of the Jesuits is a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery. But by the middle of the 1700s, the Jesuits had become big slave owners, some of the biggest slave owners in the colony of Maryland, with owning more than 200 people across several plantations in the colony. This practice of slave owning was the source of Jesuit and Catholic wealth, prestige, and ultimately power in the new United States. It was one of the ways that they claimed a foothold for themselves in the new United States. Part of that foothold, part of the vision of that foothold was education. The Jesuits are known as educators, and that was true in the United States as elsewhere. Their flagship institution from the very founding of the United States was going to be Georgetown College. This is a illustration of Georgetown in the 1830s. This was the vision of a man named John Carroll, an ex-Jesuit who was the first Catholic bishop of the United States. Now, Carroll himself only owned, we believe, 2 people over the course of his lifetime, but he was part of one of the biggest slave-owning families in Maryland, the Carrolls. The Carrolls were signers of the Declaration, framers of the Constitution. They were one of the most prominent patriot Catholic families in the United States. Carroll, the Catholic bishop, was the head of the Catholic clergy in the United States and really stood at the head of the whole Catholic community. He also stood at the apex of a network of plantations and enslaved people owned by the Catholic clergy. The Catholic slave-owning clergy of Maryland and the Chesapeake stamped Georgetown in their own image. And that meant that Georgetown, in a variety of ways, was going to be connected to the Chesapeake economy of slavery. So let me explain a few of the ways that this was true. First of all, Georgetown College itself became a site of slave life, labor, and even death. We have records of the college going back to its founding. Amazing records. One of the conditions of possibility for the story that I'm telling you today are the existence of incredible records that document not just Jesuit slaveholding and their practices, but slaveholding at the college. So we have records of enslaved people working at the college as early as 1792, a woman named Suki, to as late as March 1862, a man named Aaron Edmondson, who was still working as an enslaved person at Georgetown a month before slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia. So 70 years of enslaved labor on campus. Let me give you one example of the kind of sources we have to document this history. This is an advertisement that was published in a Washington newspaper in late January 1814. It's an advertisement for a man named Isaac, who was enslaved at Georgetown, who ran away, who sought his own freedom. In case you're not able to read it from where you're sitting or where you're watching, but everybody online, let me read this for you. $30 reward. Ran away from Georgetown College on Saturday night, the 29th instant. That means the 29th of the same month. A Negro man named Isaac, about 23 years old, quite black complexion, about 5 feet, 8 inches high, had on when he went away a short coat of drab cloth, and goes on to describe in great detail the clothes that he was wearing. And then it continues, it is probable he may change his clothing. He has learned to read tolerably well, and it is likely he may have procured a written pass. It is supposed that he has gone to Pennsylvania. He was raised at Mrs. Johnson's near Bryantown, Charles County. The above reward will be paid if secured in any jail more than 50 miles from the district, and reasonable expenses paid if brought home, or $20 if a shorter distance by the subscriber, clerk of Georgetown College, District of Columbia, John McElroy. How many of you have seen a runaway slave advertisement before? These were routinely published in American newspapers in the 18th and 19th century. They are published alongside advertisements for real estate and the shipping news and the weather, a sign of how routine this sort of thing was in early America. But what does this advertisement tell us? What does this advertisement tell us? It tells us that there were enslaved people working at Georgetown, like Isaac. We know his name. It tells us that Isaac wanted to be free. He took matters into his own hands and ran away. And it tells us something about the commitment of Isaac's owners, the Jesuit priests who ran Georgetown, to try to get him back, deny him his aspiration for freedom. Now, with many of these advertisements, we don't know what happened. All we have is the advertisement. We don't know the rest of the story. They're very one-sided in that respect. And of course, we don't know Isaac's perspective on this whole situation. But we do know a little bit more about the outcome of this case. Because not only do we have the advertisement, we have McElroy's journal. This is part of the archives of the Jesuits, which are held at Georgetown University. If you can read that, then you're better off than most of my students. But what McElroy records in his journal, he records Isaac running away, but he also records that Isaac was arrested in Baltimore, thrown in jail, and sold. So it's a sad, I wish I could tell you that Isaac was successful and gained his freedom, but the records show that he didn't. But these are the kinds of documents that illustrate the history of slavery at Georgetown College. It wasn't just that Georgetown was a site of slave labor. The students at Georgetown came from slaveholding families. Sometimes they brought enslaved people with them to campus and hired them out to the university to pay off their fees. That kind of relationship. I want to tell you about one very prominent student at Georgetown because there's a North Carolina connection. William Gaston. How many of you have heard of William Gaston? I imagine this audience has heard of William Gaston. Gaston County, North Carolina is named after him. The town of Gastonia named after William Gaston. A very prominent figure in the history of North Carolina. Gaston was born in the 1770s, and as a young teenager, he became Georgetown's first student. So we celebrate him as our first student. Not our first graduate, because he left, and then he ended up going to Princeton. He's our first student. He comes back to D.C. in the 19th century as a congressman. And as congressman, he secures a federal charter for Georgetown that allows the school to grant higher degrees. And we read that federal charter at every commencement, every year. So he is a major figure. Our main auditorium at Georgetown is called Gaston Hall. This is where all the big events are. We get the president shows up on campus. She'll speak in Gaston Hall. Thanks, Gaston Hall. I just snuck that in there. Gaston Hall is ornately decorated with historical iconography and allusions to the Jesuit history of Maryland, the history of Catholic thought, philosophy, jurisprudence. It's really, in a way, a kind of museum of Catholic history. But the one thing that Gaston Hall will not tell you is that William Gaston was a slave owner. And that when he died in 1844, the inventory of his estate included 163 people. So this is a story about the stories we tell and the stories we don't tell at a place like Georgetown. But I think that is changing a bit. One more note about Gaston, he's a complicated figure because he's often considered to be a kind of moderate anti-slavery figure in North Carolina's history because of one line in one speech he gave in 1831 where he suggested that slavery might not be the best thing for North Carolina. And also as a justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court, he authored several opinions that carved out a very limited space for the rights and privileges of slaves and free people of color, including one decision where he argued that free people of color could be citizens of the state of North Carolina. That opinion was then cited in the dissent in the Dred Scott case in the 1850s. So there might be some things to celebrate about William Gaston after all. He was an eminent justice and a key figure in the Catholic history of Georgetown and also North Carolina. One more way that Georgetown was connected to the history of slavery was through the Jesuits' ownership of a series of plantations across Maryland, the same plantations I mentioned existing in the 1700s. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Jesuits owned nearly 300 people across several plantations in Maryland. And the original business model for Georgetown was that the profits from those plantations would help to subsidize the education of free white boys and men at Georgetown. That was the idea. It didn't quite work out that way, because by the 1810s, the plantations weren't making very much money. In fact, some of them were losing money. And for 20 years, partly because of the economic situation, partly because of the changing character of the Catholic population in the United States, the Jesuits had a 20-year debate about what to do about their human property. Some of the Jesuits wanted to hold on to them as long as possible because they subscribed to the idea that the Jesuits were stewards of their Catholic souls. They didn't want to abandon that. Some Jesuits argued that they should be gradually emancipated and turned into tenant farmers on the Jesuit plantations. But some of the Jesuits argued that the Jesuits should get out of the business of slavery altogether by selling the people they owned on the market, taking the cash and investing it in other operations. By the middle of the 1830s, that last faction won the debate. And in 1838, the Jesuits sold at least 272 children, men, and women to two planters in Louisiana for $115,000 to be paid over a period of 10 years. It's about $3 million in today's money. This is probably the best documented mass sale of enslaved people in American history. We have lists after lists, contracts after contracts, correspondence detailing the nature of this sale. It's the subject of a new book by New York Times journalist Rachel Swarns called The 272, which I highly recommend, a great companion to John Thompson's memoir. The document that you're looking at here is an inventory or a census that the Jesuits took around the time of the sale, listing all of the people that they owned and were to be sold by name. By name, by age, and in some cases they're listed in family groups. We know that they had families. We know that these plantations were home to multiple generations of enslaved families with the roots that went back to the 16 and early 1700s. So the Jesuits uprooted these people, put them on ships, and sent them 1,000 miles away to Louisiana. To places like this. This is actually the site of the West Oak Plantation in Iberville Parish, Louisiana, which was owned by Jesse Beatty, one of the purchasers of the group that we now call the GU 272. This land is part of a small town called Maringouin, Louisiana. The neighboring towns Maringouin, Rosedale, and Grosse Tête, to this day, are home to many of the descendants of the GU 272. Many people have moved away, but there's a core of people in this place who are descended from the people owned and sold by the Maryland Jesuits. They now know their family histories, which they didn't know before this investigation was launched. And I'll talk more about the GU 270 descendants and their role in reckoning with his history in a moment. Some did survive through to emancipation in the late 19th century. This was a community held together by the bonds of family, by faith, because many of them were in fact Catholic, and they were members of a Catholic church in Louisiana, the place they were sold to, and by their aspirations for freedom. Many did survive to emancipation and lived to the late 19th and even early 20th centuries. And one of the really remarkable things about that community is some of them ended up owning the very land that they had been enslaved on in the 1830s and 40s. And some of those families to this very day own the land that you're looking at. So it's a remarkable story. So I mentioned earlier that the Jesuits had this justification for their slaveholding practices, that slavery was a Christianizing institution. And that ethic imposed on them certain obligations to care for the religious life of the people that they owned. So you can find in the Jesuit sacramental records, baptisms, marriages, and burial records, you can find the names of the people they enslaved. You can find the same names in the bills of sale. So if you can understand how the Jesuits could baptize the people they own one day and sell them the next, then you understand American slavery. You understand how it worked. Even after the sale in 1838, neither the Maryland Jesuits nor Georgetown actually extricated themselves from the slave economy altogether. As I mentioned earlier, enslaved people continued to work at Georgetown all the way up to 1862. Students from slaveholding families continued to attend Georgetown. And by and large, Georgetown, before the Civil War, had a kind of Southern bent to it. And that's the reason why about 80% of all Georgetown students and alumni who fought in the Civil War fought on the side of the Confederacy. The school had a Southern tilt. The Jesuits tried to remain neutral, but the university community really sided with the Confederacy. This slide is our Civil War centennial plaque at Georgetown. This was a plaque put on the side of one of our older buildings on campus in 1961, 100 years after the start of the war, commemorating, we call them Hoyas, who fought in the war. And it's an interesting language. The plaque says, from 1861 to 1865, in America's tragic epic of the Civil War, 1,130 sons of Georgetown in blue or in gray offered themselves on the altar of patriotism in the defense of the constitutional rights to which they were bound in conscience. That's the language of the 1861 centennial plaque. What that plaque doesn't tell you is that 80% of them fought for the Confederacy, and many of those who fought for the Confederacy were in fact fighting for a slaveholding republic. We could talk about that, but what I really want to point out is the language in the plaque about the blue and the gray. Now guess what Georgetown's colors are? Blue and gray. Those colors were adopted by the rowing club at Georgetown in the mid-1870s to commemorate the reunion and reconciliation of northern and southern students at the college. And by the early 20th century, those colors had been essentially adopted as the official school colors. We wear them today. Our alma mater has the words blue and gray in them. This is part of Georgetown's brand to this very day. And many students do not know where those colors come from. So this is part of what we have to teach people in this day and age. I just want to mention that in the 90s, in the Allen Iverson years of Coach Thompson, the basketball team started to wear uniforms that included kente cloth trim to acknowledge the Georgetown's Black history and African American history more generally. That is, I think, to this day, really the only kind of alteration to the school colors that provides a kind of counterpoint to this history of the Civil War that I've given to you just now. But so the point is that our school's very identity to this very day, as embodied by our colors, goes back to this history. Right? Thompson says in his memoir that we are haunted by our history, and this is one of the ways. So that's the history. That is Georgetown's, in fact, really, I've only scratched the surface, believe me, but you get a sense of the arc of Georgetown's historical connections to slavery in the way that it is, in fact, a microcosm of the whole history of American slavery in ways that we're still, that still weigh on us today. So that's the history. What about memory and reconciliation? So like I said, this history was never a secret. It was never hidden. People have been writing about it. Scholars and students at Georgetown had actually been studying it for some time. But a lot of that had faded by 2015 when the working group was launched. We have, since 2015, engaged in a kind of new phase of remembering this history and trying to come to terms with it in some new and interesting ways. So let me go to those right now. So I want to say first about the working group, that a couple of things happened during the 2015-2016 academic year when the working group that I was on met that really transformed the meaning of our effort to acknowledge the past. The first was that students got really involved. There were students on the working group, but when students learned that one of the buildings on campus was named after Thomas Malady, the architect of the 1838 sale, they got pretty angry. They did not want a building on campus named after that guy. So they started to protest. And their protests included things like sitting in at the president's office. It was a big deal. It got the attention of the news, and it accelerated our effort to acknowledge our history. And since then, ever since 2015, students have been very involved in researching our history, and coming up with creative ways to address our history, and in many ways to hold the university's feet to the fire to act on the recommendations that the working group made. So I think it's important to know that the students, even though they may not know what our colors mean, have been very involved in the effort to reckon with our past. The second thing that happened was the emergence of the GU 272 descendant community. The people descended from those who were owned and sold by the Maryland Jesuits. A lot of that has to do with the work of an alumnus from Georgetown named Richard Cimini, who took it upon himself to organize a team of genealogical researchers who tried to track down living descendants of the GU 272, and he did so. And he told Rachel Swarns, the New York Times reporter, about the work that he was doing. And Rachel published a story about it on the front page of the Sunday New York Times in April of 2016, which gave this work national exposure. It put us in the national spotlight in ways that history does not usually occupy. Most people don't care about history that much. It doesn't get on the front page of the New York Times, but this was an exception. And I think it was an exception because the revelations about the existence of this descendant community both pulled this history from the distant past into the very present. It made it very real to everybody, the impact of this history. But it also raised the question of reparations. The title of the headline of the story was, "What Does Georgetown Owe the Descendants?" So ever since then, the questions of memory and reconciliation have been closely tied to debates about reparations. So what have we done? Well, I want to say as well that Georgetown is not alone in this. Many other universities have been addressing their own histories. I don't know the specifics of Asheville, but certainly UNC Chapel Hill has been deeply involved in this kind of thing in obviously controversial ways. This is their Swarns article, 272 slaves were sold to save Georgetown. What does it owe their descendants? Universities like UVA, Harvard, and even universities abroad, like the University of Glasgow in Scotland, are wrestling with their historical connections to slavery. So we are not alone in this, but in many ways, maybe because of the New York Times story, Georgetown has become a model for how universities can reckon with their past. So one of the things we've done is to try to tell the truth. And I think this is the thing that John Thompson appreciated most, that the university was not denying its past, but trying to tell the whole truth about its past. I've been involved with that to a certain extent by creating a website called the Georgetown Slavery Archive, in which we've published a lot of the original archival material documenting the Jesuits and the university's connections to this history. So you can find that runaway ad in McElroy's journal and hundreds of other documents about our history on that website. So nothing is hidden away. And you can access it on your own computer. So we've been trying to tell the truth. The university apologized for its participation in the history of slavery. There was a ceremony in April of 2017 where members of the university community, the Jesuits, and descendants came together at Gaston Hall in Georgetown for a liturgy of what we call contrition, hope, and remembrance. And at that ceremony, President DeJoy apologized on behalf of Georgetown, and Father Tim Kosicki apologized on behalf of the Jesuits in the presence of descendants. It was a powerful, I would say it was a very powerful moment, but of course the question was, are these just words? Do you really mean it? What would give an apology credence? We've done some work to memorialize this history on campus. So the building that was named after Thomas Milady is now named after Isaac Hawkins. You can see the sign here in this photograph. Isaac Hawkins was the first person listed on that inventory that I showed you a few minutes ago. He's also the first person listed on the Articles of Agreement, the contract between Thomas Milady at Georgetown and the two purchasers in Louisiana. So by putting his name on this building, we acknowledge the presence and contribution of the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community to Georgetown's history. I think that's a significant gesture. This is not the only building on campus that's been named in recent years to commemorate the African American history of Georgetown. So the memorial landscape is changing. But not everything. There are still lots of places on our campus whose connection to the history of slavery is not marked, like Gaston Hall. But this is another one. So this is what you're looking at is a building known as the Rice Science Building. It's one of the worst buildings on campus, actually. I teach there. It's not a great building. It's kind of falling down. But this building was built on top of a cemetery. Right outside the gates of campus is a church called Holy Trinity Church, an old Catholic church that was connected to Georgetown for a long time. The second cemetery of Holy Trinity Church was on what is today Georgetown's campus, and was used during the 19th century. White people are buried there, free people of color are buried there, and enslaved people who were members of that congregation were buried there as well, including members of that congregation who were owned by Georgetown College. A woman named Margaret Smallwood is the woman I have in mind. The cemetery was abandoned by the late 19th century. Holy Trinity established another cemetery elsewhere in Georgetown, and by the middle of the 20th century, it was essentially neglected and abandoned to the point where the university felt comfortable dropping a science building on that site. Some of the people who were buried there were actually reinterred at another cemetery on the other side of DC, but many of the people buried there were left under the ground. So this building is built on the site of an abandoned cemetery, and nobody knows it because it's not marked in any way. So we still have work to do in recovering this, in changing the landscape of memory of our campus. This is an example. We've developed new curriculum around this history to teach our students and the university community about it. We've done that in tandem with members of the descendant community who have become part of the Georgetown community, in some cases as students. Georgetown has adopted a policy by which members of the descendant community who apply to Georgetown are essentially treated as legacies. They're treated the same as the children of alumni, faculty. My daughter, if she ever applies to Georgetown, would get this status, but descendants get this status as well, and some descendants have enrolled as students, including a woman named Melisande Short-Coulomb, that you see in this photograph. Melisande not only is a descendant, but she enrolled in Georgetown in 2017 at the age of 63, becoming our oldest matriculating undergraduate. And she has had a powerful impact on the university community. She's created a one-woman show about her family history called Here I Am, which last year was performed once again in Gaston Hall. So our community is changing. We're trying to teach this history. We're collaborating with members of the descendant community in bringing this history to light. And all that, I think, is part of what reconciliation means. The Jesuits, in tandem with a group of descendants, have created a foundation which is geared towards promoting concepts of racial healing and reconciliation. And the university, too, is taking more material steps to benefit the descendant community. And this is where the question of reparations comes in. The students at Georgetown were, in 2019, where they were upset at the slow pace of the slow pace of the nature of the collaboration between the university and the descendant community, and also at the lack of material reparation. So a group of students, including some students who are descendants, organized a referendum through the student government called the GU 272 referendum. And that the referendum proposed that all undergraduates at Georgetown be charged a $27.20 activity fee per semester. And that activity fee would subsidize a fund that would then benefit the descendant community. So this was actual financial reparations. That's what the students were proposing. Well, they actually conducted this as a referendum through the student government. They had the students vote on it. It was a remarkable thing. The students debated it. It was a model of intense but civil conversation about a very controversial issue, an explosive issue. In the end, the students turned out. There was actually the biggest student turnout of any referendum in the history of Georgetown student government. And 2/3 of the students voted in favor of the activity fee. So they overwhelmingly supported this gesture of material reparation. Then it went to the university, and the university said maybe. But the university, then COVID hit, and everything stopped. But just last year, the university did establish what it's calling a reconciliation fund, paid for out of general university funds, not coming out of a student activity fee. But it's going to be $400,000 a year rolled out in grants to organizations that will benefit the descendant community. The first round of grants was given out just last year. So the university is moving forward in collaboration with members of the descendant community, not just on the symbolic forms of reconciliation, but also material compensation as a form of reparation. So that is where we are today in terms of memory, reconciliation, and repair. And I just want to conclude on this note. I think it matters that this is taking place at a university. It matters that it's a Catholic university, but even more that it's a university. Universities can be models for how we face our history. And the reason why universities can be models of this is because of certain core principles that universities should hold on to, need to hold on to be able to do this kind of thing. Universities are places that have a commitment to truth, the whole truth, not partial truth. Universities are supposed to be places of civil dialogue, where people who disagree with each other can talk to each other. And finally, universities are supposed to be free spaces, spaces where we have free speech, but also academic freedom. Freedom to research difficult topics, the freedom to talk about them in civil kinds of ways, and the freedom to come up with meaningful solutions that bring people together to repair the scars of our history. I think we have some time for questions. Let's see. Yeah. Happy to answer all sorts of questions. Okay, hang on for a minute. Microphone.
You said that the college or the university president spoke on behalf of this issue, and somebody represented the Jesuits and came and spoke. Has the church itself said anything?
The Catholic Church?
The Catholic Church, yes. And or the Jesuit at the top of.
Yeah. Well, Pope Francis has recently reflected on the church's involvement in slavery recently, and particularly the Jesuit, because he's a Jesuit. So he's acknowledged that history, not in a formal apology, but in remarks that he's made. So it's reached up to that level. The descendants, a group of descendants, have been in correspondence with the leadership of the Jesuits in Rome. So they've been having some kind of conversation as well. In Washington, for instance, the Archdiocese of Washington and also in Baltimore have established committees to examine their own connections to slavery. So they're in some ways modeled after what Georgetown and the Jesuits have done. So although I don't think there's been a formal apology from the church, there's a lot of activity around exploring this history and trying to reconcile with it.
Yeah, so I appreciate you going through some of the reconciliation attempts Georgetown has tried to make for past wrongs. But to me, it seems very surface level. Georgetown has over $3 billion endowment.
Not quite that big, but it's big.
Probably in the billions, right? the DC metropolitan area has 1.5 million black residents. The population at Georgetown is probably around 6% black population of students. Do you feel like Georgetown is doing enough to really try to fix some of the past wrongs that they've done to the black community?
No. My answer is no. And you make a great point. And it's a point that a lot of folks around Georgetown make as well. That we can pat ourselves on the back for the ways we've been confronting our history, but then what about the ways we're confronting our own present? And you make a great point about the contrast between the makeup of the student body at Georgetown and the makeup of the city itself and its surrounding area. There's a huge disconnect there. I think there are lots of people around Georgetown and the university itself that are engaged in work that is trying to address those kinds of structural inequities. One great example, for instance, is our prison justice initiative. Georgetown established a degree granting program in the jails, in the prisons, in the DC area. One of my colleagues has been heavily involved in an innocence project to try to get innocent people exonerated and out of jail. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of people doing really great work, but there's basically a structural problem in schools like Georgetown, which pride themselves on being elite, on only accepting a tiny proportion of people who apply, and the broader question of social justice. So it's a contradiction I can't resolve for you, but it's there.
I have a story and a question. The story is, you probably know this, is on Finding Your Root several years ago, he had S. Apatha Murkison, and if you watch Law and Order, you know who that is. She's the lady lead detective. She's a great actress. And he had her on, and he went back to her family, and she's a descendant of the 272, plus her great, how many greats it was, grandfather, was Isaac Hawkins. So her name, her family name is on that building, which it's not clear how much of the money is for reparations. Is that going to help the descendants pay tuition and to get through college?
So on Finding Your Roots, that was a wonderful episode. And it's an example of something that's, as a historian, one of the things that's been so most moving to me of all of this is the emergence of this descendant community, them learning about their own family histories, things that they didn't know. Many of them have told me things like, well, you've added branches to our family tree. It's a beautiful thing. And I have learned a lot from them about this history. One important thing is that the archives I've mentioned are entirely from the Jesuits' perspective. We have there's a couple hundred boxes of thousands of pages of archival material. And in all of that material, there is only one document that was written by an enslaved person. It's a letter from a man named Thomas Brown in St. Louis, appealing to the Maryland Jesuits to allow him to purchase his own freedom. It's a very powerful letter. But in some ways, so there's a huge silence in the archive. Like we generally don't have the perspective of the enslaved. But the descendant community has their family histories. Maybe not going back to the 19th century, or in some cases they do, but they can tell us what happened next. What happened after 1838? What happened after the Civil War? What are these families, what's their experience today? So that's been a wonderful emergence of knowledge. I was at a reunion in early September, hosted by and organized by descendants in Southern Maryland. And it was a beautiful event, the family reunion, stitching together families across time and the wounds of slavery. One of the interesting things is that most of the GU 272 ended up in Louisiana, but some people stayed behind in 1938 for various reasons. And those wings of that community never saw each other again until recently. And so they've been able to connect in really amazing and beautiful ways. So that's great. For the tuition, my news is not so great. Georgetown does have a legacy program, so for purposes of admission, descendants are given extra consideration, but there is no separate scholarship fund. There's no separate tuition or financial aid. Descendants who are admitted to the university are eligible for the same financial aid as all other students who are admitted to Georgetown. Georgetown says it's what it calls itself a need-blind, full-need school. So it allegedly admits students without any attention to their financial need, and once students are admitted, it provides financial aid that allows students to attend. In practice, students tell me it doesn't work quite so well. They don't get quite as much as they need. But the idea is that descendants who are accepted into Georgetown have access to the same financial aid as all other accepted students. The Descendants Foundation that I mentioned is actually starting to provide scholarship money in conjunction with, I believe it's the United Negro College Fund. So there may be more money forthcoming for scholarships in the near future. Is there a microphone?
You had your hand up earlier.
Oh, thank you. As a student at Georgetown, I would find it very, very, very frustrating to have voted for the 272 and then have the board hold on to that vote even though it passed. That is not a good sign for our students today, because when they vote, their voices have to be heard. And I would have been very, very frustrated if I had been a student there and had voted for this to be passed, and then it was held. Can you elaborate on why they chose not to agree to what the students had voted for?
Yes. So first of all, many of the students were frustrated, both at the delay in the creation of a reconciliation fund and also the shift in the mechanism of the fund. Some of the students who really supported the 272 referendum were very upset that it was not funded out of a student activity fee, because they felt that that took it away from the students and made it a question of philanthropy rather than their own choice. On the other hand, the Reconciliation Fund has been established, and it's going to benefit members of the descendant community, which is a lot more than any other university has done in terms of reparations. So some students who are upset about the shift in the funding mechanism are at least satisfied that there is a fund that's going to benefit members of the descendant community. Yeah, but so a more positive way to look at it is that their vote did count, that their vote generated the momentum, the force necessary to establish the fund. So they got something really important out of it, even though they didn't get exactly what they imagined it was going to be, which is also part of democracy. Like, we don't always get the things we want, but what is it? Sometimes we get the things we need. I'm quoting the Rolling Stones here. But they made change happen. And so in that sense, I think the vote was powerful and empowering, even though they didn't get everything they wanted. Let's go, actually, here and then.
Thank you. What a wonderful, wonderful talk, and very, very thought-provoking talk. I have a question that's historically a little bit tangential, but it goes back to the Jesuits. My understanding is that the Jesuits also have a history of having enslaved a lot of indigenous and First Peoples. And I'm just curious about whether that occurred. I know it occurred on other continents as well. Did that occur in Maryland? Does it have any relation to Jesuit history at Georgetown? And is there acknowledgement there? Thank you.
That's a great question. There's also there's also a history of Jesuit efforts to convert Native peoples in the Chesapeake with varying success. I don't think we have evidence, at least from Maryland, that any of the people enslaved by the Jesuits were indigenous. They were, for the most part, African, but that may just be a question of record keeping. The Jesuits have a really complicated relationship to indigenous people across the Americas because in some places in South America, for instance, the Jesuits became fierce critics of indigenous slavery and argued powerfully against the enslavement of indigenous people by Portuguese and Spanish slavers. And in some cases sought to create communities to protect indigenous people from enslavement. But those communities became themselves the site of a different kind of abuse. And even the intent to protect indigenous people always had as its primary motivation the desire to convert them to Christianity. So it's a complicated history. There's a later history of, and this is especially true in Canada, of indigenous boarding schools sponsored by the Jesuits and other church organizations that were the sites of horrific abuse as well. So that is all going on as well, but it's not. But it's more. It's not directly connected to Georgetown's own history.
This question comes from my reading Coach Thompson's book, and the answer to it may be right there in the book in front of me, but I'm not clear on it. Back when Coach Thompson was hired in 1972, was his hiring related in any way to a recognition and reconciliation related to this history of slavery at Georgetown?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it was certainly connected to it was certainly connected to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and the way that was percolating through communities like Georgetown. But I don't think it was in any conscious way directly connected to an acknowledgement of the history of slavery. One more thing about Coach Thompson, which I should mention, is that in that last chapter, he suggests that his own family was enslaved by the Jesuits, but he says he can't prove that. He just feels it. He knows it was true. And we haven't been able to determine that one way or another. And it's just it reminds me that in the genealogical research, many people have been able to discover that their certainly descendants of the GU 272, and they've learned a lot about their family histories. But not everybody can make those connections. The archival record, the genealogical information that people have is not perfect, and it's not complete. And a lot of people get left out. And that's one of my concerns about focusing too much on questions of genealogy and who's a descendant of who. That is great for particular communities like Georgetown and the GU 270 descendant community, but it's not really a model for a broader structure of justice. And that's, I think, he's gone now, but the question about the broader relationship between the university and Black Georgetown, social inequality in general, you can't get there through genealogy. You need to find a different basis for social justice. All right, thank you so much.
And I would love to give away 3 copies of I Came as a Shadow. So if you would like a copy of the book, you can see me along the way out. Go for it. Hustle on. Come on, team. Hustle. Run.